try again. All right. We're talking today with Terry Handley of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Now, Terry, can you begin with some background on yourself?
I was born in Niles, Michigan, the first of two sons to my mother and father, Elmer and Eileen Handley, in Niles, Michigan. December 30th, 1947, my dad was pleased that there was a tax deduction with only a couple of days of expenses.
Right. What did your family do for a living when you were growing up?
Well, my father was in the skilled trades, and in a particular area with Clark Equipment Company was a welder. That he eventually earned a government certified status and went into their engineering lab for probably about the last 20 years of his working life in their developmental area where they would test big earth movers, and he would create tests for the earth movers and run dynamometers, etc. and that. My mom, after we gained age, my brother and I were in school, my mother went to work at Electrovoice, which was a speaker manufacturer in Buchanan, Michigan. And she worked there for a number of years. Once we got out of school, my mom decided to go back to college and became an RN, and then retired in the RN thing. And my father retired probably about the age of 59 from Clark Equipment Company. He was a member of the company, but they had pretty good benefit package there. And both of them are still alive and doing quite well on a family farm down in halfway between Berrien Springs and Buchanan.
All right. So basically you kind of grew up then in Niles and kind of stayed that area?
Yeah, I grew up actually north of Buchanan, and Buchanan was my hometown, so to speak. That's where I went to high school,
okay.
etc. We had a very, very blessed time in Buchanan. We had one of the best schools in the state. Athletically, we were always one of the top football teams. Our coach was is now in the Michigan Sports Hall of Fame, Bill Karpinski. He was one of my lifelong mentors and role models. My father, the other one, and my father-in-law. So I had very fortunate to have three men of varying degrees and different expertise be role models in my life.
All right. Now, what year did you graduate from high school?
I graduated in 1966, went to and attended LMC College, Lake Michigan College, with a business administration bent. Also worked in retail for Woolworth Company on their management training program. After I worked there for a few years and I got the degree, the associate's degree at LMC, then they moved me from Benton Harbor store to a Hammond store. And of course that's when in '68 they decided Uncle Sam decided they needed some people. So I was going to be drafted. In fact, the draft notice was in the mail, received it. I went down and enlisted for 2 years to receive that RA at the front of my service number.
Regular Army as opposed
Regular
to
Army
US.
as opposed to U.S., which would be a draftee. And I think there was some merit to that. I think people looked at you a little bit different, said you wanted to be there. And I'm not going to say I didn't want to be there, but I was going to try to make everything as easy on myself. So when I went into basic training, I tried to. I considered doing mind games with the platoon sergeants. I mean the drill sergeant. In other words, they weren't going to control it. I was going to do what they needed to have done, so that I could benefit myself, and I became a squad leader. Honorary then, and a platoon sergeant in basic training.
Let's back up a little bit here. The draft process is something that people are not really familiar with at all. So basically, you register when you're 18.
Registered when I was 18, went to the city of Detroit prior to the race riots in 1968. It was interesting. I think we stayed at the Pontchartrain Hotel. I went with another fellow that was in a town real near me, and we went up there, and in that time there it was kind of wide open, and I went out of the hotel and went down to a bar to pick get some alcohol, adult beverages, even though I was underage. They didn't have a problem. And I walked and I got it and came back, and I didn't think anything about walking into a bar that was predominantly a different color than I was. But when the doorman came back, who happened to be the same color as the people at the bar, he said, "Where have you been, son?" And I said, "Well, I was down this 3 blocks and this over." He says, "Don't ever do that again." And that's the area of the hub that race riots broke out. But I've never been raised to be prejudiced. I've had minorities on our football teams, basketball, wrestling teams, and they stayed at my house, I stayed at their house. The only requirement my parents put on me is if we stayed overnight Saturday night, I had to go to church the next morning with that family, whether it be Catholic, Baptist, or whatever, or Pentecostal, whatever.
Because that corner of Michigan that you grew up in, that's one that had black settlers in it from well before the
Oh,
Civil
absolutely.
War.
Yes.
And so you've had a black community there, and even in some of the smaller towns and on farms and things, and places where you don't necessarily associate with that.
Yeah.
So for you,
Hobart and down in the Benton Harbor area, yes. And that was, I was never raised with, I'll use the N word. Okay. It wasn't that my parents preached at me not to use it. They just didn't use the word. And so you grew up that way. And I consciously, even today, and you can ask any of my children, that I don't want to know what color your skin are when you're talking about a person or experience on it. I want to know what that person does. Just tell me that. Don't tell me anything else.
okay. Now you had been in Detroit. Was that for the physical at that point?
That was the physical.
Okay.
I was hoping I wouldn't have to go because I have flat feet, but not flat enough.
Okay. Were there people at the physical, as far as you can tell, who were trying to beat the system?
Oh, obviously there were. Yeah, there were some people. I could hear the scuttlebutt and talking, and there were just many people complaining about ailments that they may or may not have had. I know that they didn't have them the night before, in that particular case. But yeah, many of them did that, and understandable. So it was a time when things were on the newspaper or in the newspaper on television about deaths occurring, etc., and our deaths, and it was a difficult time. Didn't seem to be the number of people behind that like a World War II, where we weren't personally attacked. So that was an issue.
Yeah. Okay. Now you're talking about this. You said that was 68. Although 68,
early
you would have been 20 years old at that point.
Well, maybe it was right after. It was 18. No, it had to have been 66.
Yeah.
The latter part of 66 is when it was. I apologize for that.
Okay. Yeah. Well, historian, you want to get the little date thing.
Yeah.
So basically, what happens is you register for the physical, and so you get classified.
Yes.
And then they send you back, and you would have had a deferment for your 2 years in college.
I had my two-year deferment, and then when I decided, I don't know why I decided to take the job in Hammond, Indiana, with Woolworth Company, and then I got my draft notice and go back in there. So.
All right. Okay. Now, over that course of that couple of years, did you pay any attention to the news and what was going on in Vietnam?
No, I was trying to develop my career in retailing. I didn't pursue that after the war because I didn't want to live in a large city, and they wanted me there. They called me, they wanted me back, and they wanted me to be in the Chicago area. And I like to say I'm a backwoods country boy. My wife doesn't like me to say that, but I grew up in a farm, but I enjoy. I live now in Grand Rapids and love it. I love Western Michigan. I like the opportunities here, etc. But at that point in time in my life, I chose not to pursue it. But the times that we did read the paper, I wasn't anti-Vietnam. I had a friend of mine who enlisted and became a Green Beret, and he came back unscathed in that. And then I had a real close friend of mine from another high school, went over and he was killed about 3 months after, or less, after he got into country. So that kind of brought it home a little bit more to me as well. But I didn't have any animosity at all about the war. It was a little bit different situation in larger cities. There was more protesting going on, and in the smaller community, it was a more conservative bent towards it. We were asked to go, and we said, "Why not?" We were asked to go. Needed it, and that was the majority of the time that I was over there. The guys were over there. Now there were some things and decisions made that we've since learned about that probably weren't in our best interest, and maybe nobody's best interest, but we were there to protect our homeland. The domino theory and of communism and things was the selling point of that particular war. And I've made friends with several people from Vietnam who've immigrated here after the war, and they tell me, and through the research that I found, that over 1.5 million people after we pulled out were just literally slaughtered because there was some association there with the American or French prior to ending the war, and so that was not a good sight. When we left them kind of high and dry. One of the things that worried me the most was it was a feudalistic society, and over there in these little hamlets and villages, they had no running water, they had no refrigerator, they had no electricity, and yet when we built these base camps, we had that. We had ice houses, we had all the refrigerator. And so we introduced them to that way of life, but there was no infrastructure there when we pulled out. So that worried me probably more than anything, other than the reports I got of deaths. How were they going to survive? Because once you're introduced to that has to be a frustrating situation, and that's why there wasn't a lot of immigration getting out of the country.
Right. All right, let's kind of back ourselves to back into your story. We've gotten to the point where you're now told to report at the end of 1968.
Yes.
So you get the notice in December. When do you actually have to go start basic training?
Well, I because I enlisted, and they didn't.
That's right.
They didn't want me to. They didn't want to process anybody over the holidays, so they immediately said you're going to get a two-week leave. And I said, oh, that's kind of nice. And he said, but your time will count. You won't get paid, but your time will count.
Okay.
And I said, well, every minute counts. And so I reported to Chicago, and then got on a bus there, and we went to Fort Leonard, Missouri.
Okay.
And so we spent the first 3 months in basic training at Fort Leonard, Missouri.
Okay. Now, was it a full 3 months or 12 or 13 weeks rather than 8?
It was 12 or 13 weeks.
Okay. Because basic training times vary over the course of the Vietnam era.
Yeah,
it was 8
ours
for
was
some time.
pretty much a full 12 to 13 weeks.
All right. Now, what sort of reception do you get when you arrive at Leonard Wood?
Well, it's interesting. The concept is there, and if you go to any famous football, basketball coach or anything like that, the first thing they do to control you and get the message across is they tear you down mentally and physically. I chose not to let them do that to me, and I was able to be appointed to jobs because that's what they did. The drill sergeants would say, I want this guy to be a leader, this guy to be a squad leader, this guy to be a platoon guide, of which I did both during my basic training. Partway, about 2 or 3 weeks into basic training, I literally had a drill sergeant come up to me, and when we're in formation, he says, this next question, they're going to ask for volunteers. He says, I know you're never supposed to volunteer. And he says, I'm not trying to yank your chain. You should raise your hand and volunteer for this next question. Well, we said, they said, who would like to be a driver in the military? And I raised my hand. I thought, okay, I was trusting this guy was a pretty good guy, pretty good drill sergeant. Well, then I obtained my military driver's license, and I had that because I needed to transport troops. Well, I didn't do too much of it in basic training, but I did a lot of it in AIT when I went to Fort Lewis, Washington. And what did that do for me? I didn't do 1 day of KP except for maybe one time in basic training. Didn't do any guard duty as they know it. I was the driver who took the officer of the day around and guard. We let people off in post, and I went back and took a couple-hour nap while they were on guard duty at the base. And then I had to get up early and go and get the trucks and bring them over so we could transport our particular company to the various ranges and things that we had to do to get further training. So that worked out. That was a beneficial thing, and I thank that sergeant often for that. But for the most part, I mean, if would I have liked to have been somewhere else? Absolutely. But I figured that if I was going to be in the service there, I was going to be one of the best I could possibly be, only for my own personal, if not just for my own personal well-being and people, I would have more advantages, and it did turn out to be that way. You know, spit shine boots, everything was in order, all that. Now I know some people will look at that and say, well, okay, they coerced you into playing the game. No, they didn't control my mind.
Okay. Now, I guess a question for me kind of comes up here. I mean, I hear a lot of things about basic training and the approaches that the drill sergeants take. And did any of them view what you were doing as any kind of a challenge, like, or try to push you and see how far they could push you?
Initially, yes, but I wouldn't allow. I wouldn't. They initially a couple of them that I felt were less than stellar leaders attempted to break you, if you want to say that, or make sure that they indicated to you who was in charge, and I just would not allow them to do that, and because I didn't do that and I kept my cool, I was fine. And then later on, I used that aspect. I trained troops after NCO school in Fort Benning, Georgia. And I went to, they had an option. I could go to NCO school or I didn't have to go to NCO school. But I thought the more training I got, the longer I didn't go to Vietnam, the war was going to be over.
Yeah.
You know, they were talking about early outs and stuff like that. And so I went to Fort Benning, Georgia, and then from there I went on. I met up with a gentleman named John Frazier and became a lifelong buddy.
Okay, now, before we get into that, I want to kind of fill in some more pieces of the training process or to stay in the sequence. So you've got the basic training phase. What kind of balance was there between sort of the physical part and classroom or whatever? What were you doing actually in basic training?
Well, in basic training, that was all about conditioning, and you did get into some very elementary aspects of military maneuvers, but primarily it was training, obstacle courses. There were, you know, compass, map reading, etc., but on a very elementary scale. More of that followed in the infantry AIT, but the basic training, you were I won't say a slave. That's not a good word to use, but you were theirs, and I think about the end of the basic training, you got your first pass. For in that, most of the time it was for like a on base pass. You weren't going to go off base, you know, because you were just an E1 or E2, you know, at that point. So,
all right. What kind of mix of people were in basic along with you?
well, it's interesting because I did meet another gentleman, Richard Hamilton, who I became friends with. He was, I'm going to say Richard was, I was in my early 20s, he was about 25, 26, had been established, had gotten out of college, but obviously gotten out of college and graduated too soon because it was time for the draft. And Richard was very, very intelligent, just a super guy. And Richard was the gentleman who would bring life back to reality, you know. And I would be more the optimistic one of us, but Richard was that. We had some other people there that never got it. They wouldn't, when I say never got it, they were continually in disarray with their personal gear, even as much as you try to pump them up. You had other people other recruits trying to lean on them to do that. Some of them just didn't care, didn't want to do it, didn't want to be there, and it certainly showed in their attitude. But they also were the ones that probably mentally suffered the most, you know, in that regard. And sometimes you had to kind of block your brain out with some of the stuff that was going on. It wasn't abusive. There wasn't anything abusive about it, unless you're really sensitive to some of the verbal things. But in the basic training, it's their goal is to break you down, to build you back up, and it begins and doesn't get there until infantry AIT or the other areas that you did. I happen to be in infantry, and I like to say that I'm probably in infantry because when I was filling out my forms to enter the service, which there's a multitude of those, you know, they ask you questions. Do you enjoy the outdoors? And then, of course, I did. I was a Boy Scout at the age of 11 and an Explorer Scout. I like to hunt, and I like to fish, and I like to play sports. And so, yeah, I did. Well, I was honest, and probably maybe I shouldn't have been quite so honest, but I ended up in the infantry anyway.
Okay. Did they offer you OCS, or was that?
Well, that was interesting. After NCO school, there were about 4 or 5 of us in the NCO school that they called us in and said, "We like what you've done here," and they said, "We would like you to consider going to OCS, which is Officers Candidate School. You would become a second lieutenant." And it was very tempting because, again, you're talking another several months that you wouldn't be in Vietnam. And in addition, the other thing about the goal, and even in NCO school, and I did that not only because of prolonged time to go in, I also did it because there was extended, detailed training for map reading, for being a medic, a lot of military tactics. So that I did that as much for that, because if I was going to do that, I wanted to know as much about what I needed to know.
Yeah.
And OCS would have put that on beyond there. I thought about it and considered it, but then I would have had to extend my service, I think 2 or 3 years. And I decided not to do it, much to the dismay and to the sergeants that, because their goal was to get as many officers as they could. And I'm not unhappy that I didn't do it. I'm glad that I got out when I did. But had I not done that, I would have been probably doing another tour of Vietnam if conditions and things were the same.
Right.
And so that the odds aren't as good that way.
Okay. Now, how is AIT at Fort Lewis different, both physically and content-wise, from basic?
Oh, well, there's light years of difference in the terrain and the area. I love Fort Leonard Wood. I don't want anybody to misunderstand. Fort Leonard Wood was basic training, but I was there during the winter time, and it's probably not the most attractive place during the winter time in Missouri. You know, a lot of snow, and you're away from home. You were not allowed a lot of communication other than letters. When we went to Fort Lewis, spring was ready to break, and in that case, in Washington, state of Washington, at Tacoma, spring comes earlier than what I'm used to back in the Midwest. And you had Mount Rainier, and it also with the infantry AIT, you had the opportunity to have passes, and there you got to go off base. And I can remember Richard Hamilton and I, we were signing, we went together to AIT, and that was good. We went downtown Seattle a couple of times. I can remember one time directing traffic at the 5 points after leaving a bar. We were directing traffic in the middle of the intersection where the 5 roads come in together and converge. I can't tell you the names of them, but there's probably only one of them. But it was really a beautiful area, even in the training. And again, the driver thing did well. But we did well. We excelled at that. I say we, Richard and I did. The PT test was good. It was kind of interesting. They wanted you to max the PT test, and a couple of times there were a few people that decided to slow down a little bit on their running so they didn't have to max the whole thing. That was their little protest. They were athletes and they could have done it, but to protest that they would slow down in some of their PT tests. You know, then there were some extended hikes, but not near like it was at NCO school. As far as when I say hikes, but marches, right? With gear. There we trained with primarily the M14 and some of the M16, and we trained with a lot of it. You know, had earned expert marksmanship all the way through in that area. I had been raised with weapons, so I was familiar with them. But they actually taught you a little bit more about the safety and tearing them down, which I appreciated that in the AIT. But it was, Fort Lewis, Washington, I would have to say, was a good experience. I did happen to serve in infantry AIT with Jimi Hendrix's brother, Leon Hendrix, who was continually trying to figure out ways. He was having some illness, but it was interesting where we would get on a bus and leave and go into town, Leon would have been picked up in a limo and then taken away. You know, and at first we didn't believe him when they said he was Leon Hendricks, and then his brother, until we saw his brother pulling up in the limo and taking him off. Then we had to believe that. You know? And I still don't know what happened to him after infantry AIT, or what happened to that, or if he finished his career or whatever he did. But
Okay. Now, when you're either in basic or Fort Lewis, do you have Vietnam veterans who are training you, or are these mostly new guys? Or
primarily on the ranges and in the technical sides, there were a couple that were actually assigned to our company. You had a company, and you had three or four squads that comprised the company of about anywhere from 13 to 15 men apiece. In that, and so there was two sergeants. There was a what they called a platoon sergeant, and then one of his assistants. But all of them were sergeants. Some of them were E6s, some were E5s, and there were not all of them were Vietnam veterans, but the majority of them were, especially out on the rifle ranges and stuff out there. And if you treated them well, they treated you well. I mean, it was kind of interesting. It got into they were the ones that I experienced in Fort Lewis. They intentionally wanted to make sure you learned and paid attention, because they figured that would save your life someday. And so some of those things were done.
how much of the AIT was actually geared for Vietnam?
Almost all of it. I mean, it wasn't in a Vietnam setting, but it was all talking about guerrilla tactics and things what you could expect. Studying the types of mines and booby traps that could be to a certain degree. We got more of the technical training in NCO School.
All right. Now, did they have anything like a mock-up Vietnamese village to train in, or?
I don't recall that being the case.
Okay.
You know, they didn't have that. There wasn't even that in NCO School. There was a little bit of it in NCO School, but there wasn't too much of the mock-up. I mean, you did do some stuff down in some swamp areas and stuff in NCO School. There wasn't anything available near Fort Lewis in that area.
Right. But then not anything like going into a village and dealing with civilians and that sort of thing. Yeah.
No,
Okay.
that wasn't. I mean, I did not have that experience there.
Fort Polk had something like that, but but that was very much geared.
And maybe they had some. They touched on it, and I could have forgotten. But I don't really recall too much there. We had conversations with some of the Vietnam vets about what we're doing, and they tried to illustrate and talk to us about it. But it wasn't an official area.
Right. Okay. So basically, you've been pegged as somebody who should go to NCO school. And when you volunteer for NCO school, at that point, did you still get to keep the 2-year enlistment, or did you have to?
No, I didn't have to extend my time at all, which was the beauty of it. The clock is still ticking, and I'm still going. And I had a 2-week leg up on a lot of people. 2 weeks didn't seem like a lot, but when you're in Vietnam, and 2 weeks is a huge time. You always are talking about being short.
Right.
But yes, I went to NCO school. And again, I wanted to do that because of the extensive training. And there, my Boy Scout training and the map reading skills, that became a natural to me. I did it shooting azimuths and understanding with the compass where exactly you were. I've always had a fairly good sense of direction, but that helped fine-tune things in there. Learning to take different parts of the terrain and mark those as some reference point that you can always go back to and know where you are in proximity to that stuff, and you know where it is on the map. So those type of things were done well. The medical side with the training in that was good. That was far and above anything we got in AIT. You touched on it, but you went not to the degree there.
Do you learn radio procedures and that kind of thing?
Yes, all the radio procedures, and that was important too. Many of the people that came out of NCO school who decided not, I think there might have been a couple that decided to go to OCS, not as many as what they would have liked to have had it. There was about 5 or 6 of us that they wanted, and I think only 1 or 2 did go. In fact, I know one fellow that I was in infantry, Jim Sastrin, who's from Chicago. He went through OCS then, But the rest of us didn't, and Richard Hamilton was not about to extend one day of service if he could help it, and I don't blame him. I mean,
At the NCO school, did they wash a fair number of people out? I mean, or people just decide they didn't want to do that after all, or did most of you?
There were a few. Obviously, that was a volunteer service, and so there were some that left. I don't know what the attrition rate would be, but there were there. But the emphasis on physical training and PT increased, and to the point where you were expected to do so many pull-ups in line before you did PT in the morning before breakfast was even started.
And you're now in South Georgia, and we're in the summer, right?
Right, and that was pretty warm. And one of the things that we became very acclimated with was chiggers, and those things are not fun. And chiggers are almost invisible. They're small, little, minute, red animals, and they like to burrow, and they can be painful. So you have to. I think the antidote was I can't remember exactly what it was, but something that you could put on them, and away they would go. And it was a weird application. I can't even remember what it was. It wasn't a fingernail polish, but it was something that would obviously rob them of oxygen and then gone away. But when you're crawling around in the sand in the red clay in Georgia, it's an interesting time. Ironically, after I got out of Vietnam, I met my wife, and that we did move to Atlanta, Georgia, with Michelin Tire Corporation as a manufacturer's rep. So I went back down there too. But no, that Fort Benning was an interesting time. That's where the increase in the forced marches started. They weren't trying to tear you down there. They were trying to build you up mentally. They wanted to make you mentally tough, because if you're going to lead men, you had to make some decisions. You had to make them quickly, and you had to always keep everybody's best interest in heart. But you had to follow, protocol. And so there was a lot of that. It would be like a preparatory officers candidate school in a lot of ways.
Right.
In that.
Okay. And did they ever take you down into the swamps of Georgia at all for training?
Yes, we did that. There was they had what they called ranger training, and there was a week of and maybe it wasn't quite a week, but it was a good portion of the week where you would go down and you tried to survive on the land as much as possible, and work out. And they were still, they just didn't leave you out to do it. They pulled ambushes and things like that on a person to try to, get them conditioned. Now there's where you started to simulate a lot of Vietnam training or guerrilla warfare in the jungles out there. But that they had already extensively trained us in some of these other areas before. And again, additional weaponry, calling in airstrikes, calling in artillery, making sure that you could really read a map and knew exactly where you were at all times, which is something that the guys appreciated me. Most of the guys in my squad initially kind of appreciated that. And there was a few times when I had people refuse to walk point, which is the first person in line. And I said, okay, you won't do it, I'll do it. I just want you to know that I've got the map. I've had to study with the company commander. I know where we're going, but that's okay. I'll walk point. And after about 10 or 15 minutes, they tapped me on the shoulder. Sarge, you better get back. You better get back in line, which was traditionally about the third person back. I had point and slack and then me.
Okay.
And my RTO, Shorty, behind me.
All right. So when did you finish up NCO school?
NCO school was finished sometime in November of '69. So I went through 3 months of basic training, 3 months of AIT, and then 3 months or more. There had to be extra weeks.
Didn't you also have a stint as a
I'm
drill
sorry,
instructor?
I apologize. After NCO school, I went to Columbia, South Carolina, Fort Jackson, and that's where we trained troops. And that's interesting because I had with me Chuck Curse, myself, Richard Hamilton, and John Frazier. We all four were in charge of a company of AIT people recruits, and we were training them. And the four of us got together and we said, you know, we're going to discipline these people a lot differently than we got treated in AIT. And so we had a meeting with the whole group, and we said, we're going to give you post privileges for the rest of this day. This was on a Saturday they got there, and they come out of basic ahead of anything. We said, the only thing is we want you back by this time, and we'll have an inspection Monday morning. So you won't be doing anything Sunday, but on Monday morning, when they have the company-wide inspection, we had the platoon. You will be number one, and if you're not number one, you won't have post privilege for quite a long time. We, with that attitude, and did it. We had people making. Anybody who walked in our barracks, they were asked to put socks over their boots so they wouldn't mar the spit shine floor. And I mean, literally everything gleamed. We only missed 1 week in the entire training process of not being number one in the inspection. But the attitude, the esprit de corps, was always good. One of the things that people would do that we even went through is push-ups. And if somebody was cajoling somebody else or being disruptive in formation while there was presentation going on, the sergeant would go around and say, drop and give me X number of push-ups. Well, because we had just come out of a pretty intense condition, we were in fine shape. So whenever we did it, me in particular, I would, sometimes if I would kind of single out some of the biggest, toughest looking guys. And if I watched for them to make a mistake, and I would say, recruit, get out here. You're going to drop and give me 20. And so he'd get ready to go because I think he's out. Well, I said, but you're going to do them with me. And I would intentionally go slow and up until I could. I didn't try to break them mentally, but I wanted them to understand that we were in as good a shape or better than they were, and that they needed to do it. But I did it with them, and that's the difference, that we didn't have it in there, and so did the rest of the guys. They said, we'll do that, and we'll try and train them that way. But we kept a fantastic esprit de corps through that training that we had. We gave those people, and we were the number one platoon, far and above anybody else for attitude, I believe.
Okay. Now, as I understand it, the way these units are structured, you're going to have some kind of. You've got some guys like yourselves who are going through their own training process, now training others, but you're being supervised by others, either officers or senior sergeants. What did those guys think of what you were doing?
They the first time that we started doing this, says, are you sure you want to do that? And he said, yeah. And we said, well, we'll let you go. We'll let you see what it'll do, which was kind of nice. They could have nipped it in the butt, but they didn't. And so it was done and performed well. As far as the end result was good. We had a good attitude. They liked the training. It carried over on the rifle ranges and everybody else. Everybody else was lifting everybody else up. Says, we didn't have to do as much discipline because their cohorts were saying, "Hey, you got to get with the program. Yeah. You have to. This is a team effort, and that's the way we kind of looked at it. And a lot of that carried over in Vietnam. I never ask anybody, even in Vietnam, to do something that I wasn't willing to do myself. I just refused to act like that.
Right. Okay. Now, a little earlier, you were starting to talk about John Fraser. When did you first meet him?
John Fraser and I met at the beginning of NCO School. Okay. He was from Maine, Rangeley, Maine. It was a town of about 200 or 300 people, right in the heart of Maine, in beautiful, beautiful country. And if there was ever a backwoods country boy, it would have been John Fraser. Heart of gold, one of the strongest grips I've ever seen, and I always had a pretty good arm wrestling. John Fraser, I couldn't hold a candle to John. He grew up chopping firewood for fuel for cooking, and that his mother died at an early age, so he was left just as himself and his sister. The father had to watch him, and so his grandparents living next door raised John a lot too, because his father had to be working. And John became a remarkable guy, and so the bond was John Fraser, Richard Hamilton, Chuck Curse, who happened to be from Orangeburg, South Carolina, and myself. Those four kind of gravitated together, and we went through and trained troops together. John, we met up, like I said, at NCO School. And then John and I went on to train troops together. Well, after we trained the troops in Fort Jackson, South Carolina, we got our orders for Vietnam at the same time. So John and I, we and Richard, we all went over there together. When we got to Cam Bay, Richard got orders for Airborne Division, and John and I can't remember where Chuck got his orders to, but all of us survived. John and I got 101st Airborne Division together. So that's fine. So we report, we get up to I Corps, right up by there together.
To back up a little bit, you finish NCO School. Do they give you leave home before you ship over
Yes.
to Vietnam?
Yeah, and I'm not sure what the duration of that was, but the bottom line is that we ended up, reporting late to early December back to go to Vietnam. So there was a few weeks in there that we had to leave then, and I think after the training we got another small leave.
Right. And then where do you report to ship out?
Well, I reported to O'Hare Airport.
Okay.
And that's another unique situation. My dad had to work, so he couldn't drive with me. And my mom and my brother went. My brother was asleep in the car, and I drove. That was my last time to drive for a while. And I drove to the airport, and from Buchanan, down here about a little over 90 miles to the airport. And my mom fell asleep in the car, and I was quiet. This was after midnight in the morning. And I was contemplating what was ahead, and this is the honest truth. A voice came to me, which I believe was God, and he said, "Don't worry, son, I will take care of you." And I looked at my mother, and I looked at my brother, and they were sound asleep. And I said, "Okay." I mean, that's all. And so I had the attitude going over there that I trusted that. That doesn't mean that you did things precariously there at all, but you had that inner confidence, that things were going to be okay. And that was tested a few times in that. But I went to O'Hare. We flew over. And I met John out in Fort Lewis.
Okay,
because
so
that's where we're based.
So you flew commercial from O'Hare to Washington,
Right.
and then
we got on an airplane, and then we went to Anchorage, and there we really got to see Anchorage about half an hour. Wasn't very long, and then they decided to fly from Anchorage to Hawaii. Now we got off the plane in Hawaii.
So Anchorage to Hawaii.
Yeah,
That's kind of odd. All
yeah,
right.
it is really odd, but that's the way that we ended up, and I actually walked through the airport, saw the fish and stuff in the pool, and then on the way back. But then we ended up in Cam Bay, and then John and I got our orders for 101st Airborne Division.
Okay. When you arrived at Cameron, was it during the day or at night?
No, it was during the day, and then one of the things I noticed was the smell. It was unique. I can't even describe it now, but so muggy and warm. It was definitely, and the one thing I didn't realize at the time, but the thing that struck us most was the noise of helicopters consistently, and that was persistent all the way. Even when we were out in the bush, in the faint background, you always heard helicopters, helicopters, helicopters all the time. In fact, when we came back from Vietnam, one of the things that I noticed was the silence. That was not, the helicopters were no longer there. And occasional, but not like it was in Vietnam. It was a constant drone, day and night.
Okay. Now, did you spend any amount of time at Cameron, or did you ship out right away?
As I recall, we spent maybe a day or two there, and then we were trucked up to Phu Bai, and there we went to Camp Evans from there, to the 101st.
Now, were the trucks going in a kind of a large convoy, or by themselves, or how did that work?
As I recall, there were a few trucks at a time. Yeah, and it was on Highway 1, whatever that they called it, and no incidences of that type of stuff happening. So I'm sure that they were well patrolled, and they had that the containment there for that particular thing.
And sort of what impression did you have then of Vietnam as you were driving on up to Phu Bai?
Really didn't know what to expect. You heard the horror stories, and you expected it to be kind of like an Audie Murphy movie 24/7, which in fact wasn't the case. And that's kind of the dangerous part of it, because you're lulled into complacency if you're not careful. But we didn't know really what to think. You're intimidated. I don't care how well assured you are as a person in life. When you're up there and you're in that, we were intimidated. And here we're coming with breaking starch from training our troops in Fort Jackson, South Carolina every day. I mean, we were spit shine boots, the whole 9 yards. When we got to our Camp Evans, and finally John and I were assigned to the same battalion, the same company together, and then he went to the 3rd platoon, I to the 2nd platoon. So we were there all the way through the war together. Even though we did individual exercises or missions as platoons, there was only a couple times we went together as a company. It was primarily platoon. It was all coordinated,
Right.
but we were not in the same group. But there you became intimidated. We went to Delta Company, 1st of the 506, and their reputation, they were nicknamed the Delta Death Dealers. They were a pretty strapped company. They had their stuff together, and I would say through my first 3 months there, we were in pretty good shape, although we did lose the sergeant that I was to replace there, and that's what brought me to the reunion down there, but I can tell you about that a little later.
Okay, so you get up to Camp Evans. That's where the brigade is based, basically.
Yes.
That's where your company area
Yes.
is, and so
Yes.
forth. Okay, so you get up, you're assigned. Now, is this when you get issued a weapon and this kind of
Yes,
thing?
yes, we get all the weapon, all the gear, and that, and the people coming out of the field, they didn't dress like we were. They used to say, but that's when you received an issue of clothing later to find out that they just, if it was washed and clean, you put it on. If you could kind of fit it, and you wore it. It wasn't like we were assigned any particular clothing. You just took what you could, you put it on, and it was all the same. We did not, for the most part, we didn't wear any kind of markings to designate rank out there, or if they were, there was some subdued, but most of us did. Now the officers maybe wore some subdued stuff some on their clothing, but most of the time even they didn't do that. Maybe the at the battalion level, colonels and lieutenant colonels, majors would do that, but they weren't in the day-to-day. They were coming in and observing and that stuff.
Yeah, the rest would not want to be targets.
No, and so you had all kinds of people. I did notice, and then I did that habit too. In the beginning, you have a rucksack and you're packing a lot of food. At the end of the year, and some ammo. As you get further into the year or time that you're going to be there, your ammo seems to supplement and then to replace food. So realizing that you can never have enough ammo, and that was a mindset that people took, and or grenades and other claymore mines, etc. So you packed them just as much as you possibly could bear.
They've gotten up there in December. Now, does the company come into the camp, or were they in camp when you joined them, or did you go out to the field?
Oh, they actually had come in for Christmas. We had a Christmas dinner in the mess hall, so we got instituted that first time experience, and the company was back in place. Then this was Christmas Day, or Christmas Eve, excuse me. We got our dinner because we were going to be going out. And so we went out in the evening, and we got to our NDP, which is
Night deployment position.
right. And so we did that by the light of basketball flares. They were dropping them from helicopters so they'd illuminate and we could follow. And finally, we got in a position where we found a trail, and we set up in an ambush positions along the trail. Nothing new there, and did that. And we weren't digging in because it was dark. You don't dig after dark because that's like a beacon to anybody who may be out there, and you never know. And so I'm of course, I'm not sleeping. I'm not going to go to sleep. I knew that wasn't going to happen, so I was awake. I mean, because you don't know what to expect. About, I'm going to say around the middle of the night, all of a sudden somebody's talking to us, and it's kind of interesting because I had a machine gunner on one side of me, and then there was me, and then there was another fella that had another rifleman, and this gentleman was talking to us. We weren't understanding it. Well, it was because he was a Viet Cong, but he thought that we were some of his friends, you know, and so he was talking to us, and the machine gunner couldn't get his weapon around, so he asked me to lend him mine. So, you know, and so he got it and he fired at him, and then the guy took off, and we heard other people fire just down the trail there that were part of our own same men, and then nothing. And so now you know you're not sleeping, and neither are most of the other people, because they, you know, they encountered one person and you know what they're going to do the next. And then the next morning we found then he had gotten off the trail within 5 yards of where some of our other people were all night, but he was wounded bad enough. But then he got up and tried to attack, and then he was killed. But that was the first night, and I asked, I said, does this happen every night? He says, oh, good Lord, no, it doesn't happen every night, thank goodness. But he was part of a group, a paymaster group that had come down, and we found the other fellows later on. And there was a bunch of Vietnamese money on him, piastres. And a lot of them were in 5 piastre notes. And we, each of us turned in and bought with NPC money, our military pay currency. We bought those piastre notes as a souvenir, and I still have it today. And we took that extra money, and that became our party fund for when we're back and we could buy beer in a dealer's den, you know, back in. So that's what we did with that. And I found a 9mm Russian revolver or pistol on one. That never made it back with me. It could have, but when I got wounded, the quartermaster decided that that probably shouldn't go back with me. I didn't have the time to get all the proper paperwork done, and so I'm sure somebody's got a souvenir. That's okay. But that was the initiation, the first day in. Then things quieted down. The thing about Vietnam that I experienced is the lulls in action, and that will kind of lull you into making poor decisions. So you always have to be on the alert in that regard. And we were traversing that first mission along the bottom of the first of the ridge lines that were the mountains to get back into I-Corps. Not too far from the DMZ, but not right on the DMZ at that particular point. And so we did that, and then we went on through other place sorties and went out. We were out probably a good month or month and a half before we came back in.
Okay. And were you still mostly kind of in the coastal area south of the DMZ, or were you going farther into the hills?
No, we were going farther into the hills. We weren't necessarily by the DMZ. I say up by the DMZ because that was the closest to us, but we were starting to be sandwiched between there and the A Shaw Valley. Our unit had, when I say our unit, 101st, the first of the 506 was present on Hamburger Hill, and that's where a high school friend of mine and later fraternity brother at LMC was at Hamburger Hill, and this gentleman earned 2 silver stars there. In pretty close proximity to each other, and he would be the one that you'd least likely expect. His name was Ted Tees. What a neat guy, a funny guy. You know Ted Tees?
We interviewed him a while back.
Okay, well, he's a funny guy, a nice guy, pleasant guy, and he's the reason I'm alive today. After we did several missions, and there were some few deaths, not very many, and one of them was a sergeant that I replaced. That was probably the real initiation to booby traps and things, because we landed on a booby trapped LZ. But anyway, on to that. Then the pressure started mounting. I was leading a 13-man team in the jungles without the aid of a medic, which I really protested with the lieutenant, and he decided to keep the medic with him, and it's his right to do that. So I said, okay, I'll have to really retrain. So we talked to the guys. I said, I'm going to be the guy that has to help mend you, but I'm not a full-fledged medic. But that bothered me more than anything else because I was worried about the care of the men. But we were out looking around, and through the night, several nights in the jungles and in the mountains, it was heavily infested. It's interesting. We didn't have a lot of skirmishes then, but it was heavily infested because at night we could hear them looking for us. Seriously, you could hear them walking in the bushes, and sometimes the pressure got so much that one night I prayed to the God and I said, look, if I'm gonna be wounded or killed, I want to be done this night. I don't know that I can serve the men well. I was doubting, that. And it's interesting because the next morning I got a radio call, and the radio call was from Ted Teese. Obviously you can't say it, but I recognize his voice, and he said, I'm sorry to inform you that your grandmother has passed away. And because you lived with her, I've arranged for an emergency leave home for you of 30 days. And I started to say, but yeah. He says, I want to be clear, Ted said. I arranged for emergency leave home because you lived with your grandmother. Well, she lived next door. But that whole story was kind of, well, he could do that, and I didn't ask. I didn't know anything about it.
What was his position at that point?
He was an RTO to the lieutenant colonel, the battalion commander.
Okay.
And that was a reward. He got out of the field. He'd gone through NCO School too, I believe.
Yeah.
And he'd gotten out of the field because of what he had done there. He didn't ask for it, but they rewarded him for that. And he was there, and so that was. He arranged for me to come home, and then a lot of stuff happened while I was home. But prior to that, we saw each other one other time. I think it was on Catherine, I believe. And Ted had flown out with the lieutenant colonel, and they were staying and of course they had a great big TOC tent, Tactical Operations Center, in the middle of it, and that's where he was. Ted was with the lieutenant colonel. Well, when we got up there was a couple areas I told the guys I went in clearer vision, fields of fire, so we were trying to clear it out further down, and there was one particular rock that was really stubborn. It rolled down and got wedged against the stump. And the stump was probably about 4 to 6 inches in diameter, maybe 3 or 4 feet off the ground. It was whacked off. But somebody could literally potentially climb up to that thing. That caused a problem for us. So Shorty, my RTO, who happened to be from Puerto Rico, at that point he still wasn't letting everybody know he could speak English as well as the rest of us because he wanted to not get a lot. He went through almost the whole military not understanding. And finally one day he said to me, he said, Terry, he said, I talked to you, I had something to tell you in his broken English. He said, what's that? He said, I can speak English as well as you and anybody else. I said, all this time we're talking about the Southern Cross and everything, and I'm listening to you, you're trying to decipher to me, and I'm trying to pull out what Spanish and English you're trying to say, and you can speak. Yeah. Why? He says, then I didn't have to do quite as much when people ask me, because I say, no comprende. And he did that. But Shorty was a great guy. I gave him some responsibility to try to get that rock and stuff down the hill. And he blew it a couple times, and finally he got a little frustrated because it wasn't moving very far. So he took an entire case of dynamite, and he dug all around, and he put it there, and he tied all the sticks together with det cord. That's detonation cord. It explodes. It burns, but it burns so fast it sounds like it's exploding. And we did our customary pop of the red smoke, so no helicopters fly over. And he touched it off, and we were in our foxholes, and it made an enormous amount of noise. The stump went up in the air, the rock went down the hill, and in a few minutes, Ted Teese comes running out of the TOC tent, and he says, you darn near killed the lieutenant colonel. I said, what are you talking about? He said, "Are you kidding me?" He said, "When that went up, that stump went up in the air. It came right straight down through the top tent, and the colonel had been resting on a cot. He sat up because of the concussion, and when he sat up, that thing came down and went through and stuck in the ground through the cot, the cot, and so." And that right after that, he says, "Well, he's calling for a bird. They're going to go back in." They decided, and so he never came back out while our company was on there again. And that's one of the funny things about that. You know, there was another time prior to me going home on emergency leave that, no, it was after the emergency leave where we were set up as a radio relay team between the company commander and one platoon and the third platoon, or whichever one first or second, and we were the second platoon. Well, I took half of my men, half of the guys from my platoon, and we went up on top of them. We were relaying radio message back and forth because the radio signal couldn't carry over the mountain. And that was the time when I took the guys straight up the side of the mountain, and they were really complaining, but then they realized, I said, well, I don't want to follow that trail. My goal was to get everybody back alive. I said, now if you think we want to go there and it could be ambushed or booby trapped, we can try it. And they decided they want to climb with me. So we went up the top, and that was pretty good duty because we'd move about 100 meters on this ridge line farther down that way, then we moved back. And we never stayed in the same place twice. Never. That was always a policy we did. Well, we had our ambush always set up for the trail that was coming along, and one morning one of the guys said to me, he says, looked over there and there were heads bobbing down the trail. You can only barely see the crown of the heads. You couldn't see anything else. And I said, okay, let's wait. And when they were available, we blew our ambush.
Okay, I'm going to pause right at that moment because this.
Okay, we were discussing the booby trap or the ambush that we had set up on this trail, and when we were at the top of a ridge line for the radio relay teams. And one of my men had pointed out that there were heads coming down the trail, and we could only see their crown of their head, so we didn't, no other part of identification except their heads coming down. And so we waited for what we deemed was the appropriate time, and then we blew our claymore mines and fired up the area. As soon as we did that, almost immediately, a family of monkeys, apes, shinnied to the top of the trees and started swinging down on the limbs to the right where the way we had come up. And it seemed a little bit humorous at the time, but then it became a little bit more serious. When we went over there, there was not one piece of hair. There wasn't any blood. We hadn't hit a thing, at least that was traceable back. And so right then and there I said, guys, we've got to go back and study how we set up our ambushes again, because we would have only ticked the enemy off. They'd have really been angry. What happened? And so we went back and studied that. And then a day later, of course, that information gets down to the rest of the company that, Mike too, Handley, and his squad had ambushed some monkeys and not gotten anything. And so a couple days later, at night, I was woken in the middle of the night and I said, Sarge, look down there. And there was a fire maybe a kilometer and a half away down in the valley that we could see. It was just a fire. And there was no friendlies in the area, in that particular area. And so I said, okay, well, I requested a fire mission. And we got it. The first 3 rounds were off a little bit. Then the rest of them were fire for effect. HEs, which is high explosive. And the fire went out. Thought, okay, that's probably, we'll look at it in the morning, or somebody will look at it in the morning. About 20 minutes to half an hour later, the fire reappeared. So we already had the coordinates. So I ordered another fire mission. Fire went out. The third time, a half an hour or 45 minutes later, the fire reappeared. And this time I called in the mission, but the company commander said, and I don't know if that was Ranger or Delta Dealer or who it was, I don't think it was Ranger that yet. He said, no, maybe it was Ranger. He said, Handley, he didn't call me Handley, it's Mike too, the call sign. He says, what are you smoking up there? He thought we were getting along, but it was true. And they went the next day to find the area, and they couldn't find a thing. The only thing we could determine was that that fire was probably in a cave, and they had dropped a shroud of some sort over the fire so we couldn't see it. And then after they probably filled the cave with smoke, they opened it up again so they could. And that must have been the only explanation we had, because we couldn't find a thing. You know, you should have been able to find something there, because they knew the exact coordinates that they went to, and the fire went out. So when they searched high and low, we couldn't find anything. So that was an interesting tidbit there.
Okay. Now, when was it that you got the emergency leave?
I got the emergency leave sometime around the latter part of March,
Okay.
the last few days of March, and that's when my grandmother had passed away, and Ted Tees arranged for me to get an emergency leave home, and I went home, and when I didn't get in time for the funeral, and it took a little time to get home. It took me 18 hours to get from Vietnam to Chicago Airport, O'Hare. It took me another 18 hours because now we're talking the first day or two of April. It took me 18 hours to get from O'Hare back to my own home. And the reason for that, there was the worst blizzard of the winter in 1970. And so while we were over Chicago, over the Lake Michigan here, I was supposed to land in St. Joe Benton Harbor Airport, but they closed the airport down because of the snow issues, and we flew into Grand Rapids Airport. At Grand Rapids Airport, they ordered buses to take, and I was on a civilian flight. They took to take us down to St. Joe Benton Harbor. Well, on the way, the buses, one got stuck and one got broke down. So I asked them, I said, would you pay for a taxi? Because I wanted to get home at this point in time. And they said yes. So I got a taxi, and got in the taxi, and the taxi broke down in South Haven. Now, so the taxi driver and I thumbed a ride with a trucker, and my dad was waiting with his four-wheel drive near there, because he called ahead, the truck driver called ahead and said, can you call this number and tell them that we'll be there? And so I did that, so I was home. But then coming back, the leave is up, and coming back to Vietnam in Cam Ranh Bay, I ran into two of my people, Jesse Ortega and Shorty, and I said, "What are you doing? You're supposed to be out in the field." "Well, we re-up to get out of the field." I said, "Really? Why?" And then they went on to explain that when I was gone, that the sergeant that took my place, and half of my guys had been killed, along with the lieutenant. At that point in time, and there was some bad things happened in and around Marine, I believe,
Yes.
is where that happened, and Lieutenant Fletcher was that lieutenant. And I listened to what their stories were, and a few people else that had been there, and I'll just leave it at that there was some issues there.
Because we've interviewed several people who were there as well. So Ken David was one, Steve Adrianas. So we've got a couple of different accounts of
and
that.
I did and still do to a certain extent. I feel a little guilty about that, and the reason I say that is because potentially maybe there could have been some decisions made that might not have had the same result. But then on the other hand, that isn't true. I don't think. I mean, I still have a little bit of that guilt there. I feel because my guys were there and I wasn't there.
Yeah.
But I want to reflect back on the first initial trip to O'Hare Airport, and God said, "I'll take care of you."
Yeah.
And my grandmother passing, who faithfully wrote me twice a week, and described, she spent the last winter of her life in Scottsdale, Arizona, with my aunt and uncle. And I asked her, I said, "Don't you enjoy being warm, for that?" And she said, "Terry, I miss the change in the season." Went on to describe the birds at this particular time, the flowers at this particular time. And ever since that, I've really appreciated the climate in Michigan and the changing of the seasons and that. So the Lord was looking out for me. And then we went on to, that then pretty soon it became May, and May was the start of Lone Star.
Or Texas Star.
Texas Star, excuse me.
The Ripcord operation.
The Ripcord operation, and we were in and about, and we witnessed from afar the consistent shelling of Ripcord at that point.
Can you talk a little bit about just returning to your platoon after all that stuff happened?
Well, when I got back to the platoon, that stuff had happened, and what they were doing was reorganizing, bringing more people in. And so I didn't immediately go out there. It was probably a couple weeks. And I said, well, what's the deal here? And they said, well, don't worry, we're going to get, and they had to bring some other people in, some other new people involved in that. And so I didn't. But once I got back out there, I think maybe that's when Catherine happened, when the lieutenant, Ted Teese was still there. But he was ready to go home, and in fact, I think he went home really shortly after it. He was about 6 months ahead of me.
Because you did mention Shorty being the one who was blowing up the...
Yes, Shorty was being... I can't find him to today. His name is Oscar Canales. And he was from Puerto Rico. But I searched high and low. I mean, I think I have him on orders, but I refuse to. I mean, he's got a social security number that I have, but I don't want to get into that stuff. But he was a lot of fun. He was Shorty was short, but a great RTO and he liked to carry a thumper,
It's a grenade launcher?
Yeah, the grenade launcher. He liked to carry that. So I carried extra stuff for him as well, extra ammo, because like I said before, you didn't have enough in there. And so there were. We didn't lose any men up until we got involved in the extraction when we went into a hot LZ. Around, what was it? That was probably, the 22nd, 23rd?
Yeah, July 22nd, July, yeah.
Yeah, July. And in between that time, I think we went to Eagle Beach in between that time, which was an in-country R&R for a couple of days. We went into the village, and that was an interesting time. Weren't supposed to, but we paid an MP a buck, military currency. We could pass through the gate. Weren't supposed to, but he let us do that, and that was kind of fun. We had one intention of going into the village. We hadn't seen women for a long time, and that was our intention. But so as a salesman, and I was a salesman before and a salesman afterwards, I was in line in this particular hooch, and I decided to tell the guys and someone there, I said, I'm going to go up and scout, and I'm going to come back and give you a detailed description of, selections and things like that. Well, when I got up there was only one person in that hooch besides the military guy. So I went back and I told John, I said, John, you are number 18 in line, I'm number 19, and there only happens to be one woman there. And I said, I don't know about you, but I couldn't be in country long enough for that. So he and John and I left, and we went back to the compound and on the shore and bought a case of beer and commenced drinking the beer until it was gone and falling asleep on the sand. And that
Probably a healthier option.
It was a healthier option. And one particular guy, well, the one of my guys got the nickname of Oatmeal, instant oatmeal over there, and I'll let it go with that. Through that instance, but then we that was about the few of the times that, other than being in the rear, a couple of times we didn't get together as a unit. I mean, you were in the rear maybe for a stand down for a day or two, and then you resupply and new clothes, etc. Most of the time we're out there in platoon size units. The last time that we're out there with Ripcord, they decided to put us together as a company unit. And that's the time that where we were extracted from. We went into a hot LZ, and which means that people are firing at you as you're coming in.
Before we kind of get into that story, I want to kind of fill in a little bit more about sort of just the nature of the experience here. When you would go out in the field and be out there for several weeks at a time, and over the course of that, would you spend time on fire bases, or they fly you in and out?
There were a few fire bases. I missed one or two with the leave home. I think I missed one for sure, Marine, and then we spent a lot of time in the booties. Now I noticed that after the in-country R&R, then we were assigned to the lowlands, which was the lowlands was around Camp Evans, between there and the hills or the mountains. And actually, that happened before. That happened before Maureen.
Yeah.
And that was because Lieutenant Fletcher was still there and alive. Lieutenant Fletcher had one of the group that he was with. I had one half platoon. He had the other half, and I think Gib Rossiter was with the other half too. They spotted some smoke, and so the company commander said he wanted Fletcher to check it out. Well, I got assigned that task, and so we made our way to the position, and what we found was it wasn't smoke. It was a hot spring coming into a cold spring, and the steam, and it was right at dusk, so it appeared as if it was smoke. It was rising. So it was getting late, so we set up a night defensive position right there, called in our coordinates, and in the morning we were off. In other words, we were set up specifically for night ambush. That's what this mission was for, to try to get people to go into Camp Evans. And so the guys, we spread people out, and the guys took turns getting a warm bath. We moved some rocks away and had a kind of a little pool, the hot and cold running water coming in there out of the springs. And we did that. Everybody got pretty clean. And then what I did was, we really liked that spot. That was we didn't have warm water. We had a cold, the barrel, it was room temperature, but at less than 98 degrees, it felt cold to us. But here, we had warm water. So I got the bright idea of, and I don't know how bright it was, but it was, I knew our Delta Tangles that were pre-assigned a particular spot on the map that we always referenced where our position was. And I also knew how far away or how close fire missions could come to our place, and then how far. So what I did on the second day, we didn't move. But that night I reported falsely that we'd moved to this particular position, which was still ensured us that we were within the envelope of staying safe from any field of fire. And so we did that. So the guys really liked us so much that we stayed a third day. And now that was the only times that we did that. Now we varied where we were, but it was really close to that area. But we would not stay in the same spot. We'd move over here a little bit, move over there a little bit. But we were always in the same spot. We always gravitate back to that place. On the third day, when I reported our position, company commander says, "Okay, Mike 2, are you clean yet?" He had determined that we hadn't really left the area real closely, and I triangulated. I was not as smart as I thought I was, but we did have, that was a kind of a fun time, that we did that in the lowlands there. And then of course there was always the occasional bomb, 1,000-pound bomb crater that went through a stream that made an instant swimming pool. And so those were some of the fun times that. And you really got, during those times, you got to know the people a little bit better. It was the lowlands was a little bit more slack in duty. I mean, it was a little more relaxed. You had to worry about it at night. Nobody in their right mind was going to come during the daylight, walk across the plains to come to Camp Evans. That would be kind of crazy, because there was a lot of helicopters and stuff.
But did Camp Evans get hit with mortars or by sappers or rockets while
a few times when we were in position, there were guard duties that we pulled out on the perimeter, and we took it pretty seriously. Of course, some people use it as a chance to really relax and smoke or do whatever they did. We had a policy in the field that none of that stuff happened in the field. We just weren't going to tolerate, and the guys pretty much abided by that. The only thing we might have out there, we had a couple of guys in the squad named Campbell and Mintz, and we called them Colonel Campbell and Major Mintz, obviously for their last name. And they were from Kentucky, and they were always getting care packages with a fifth in it, and that. So they would share that a little bit, and we'd have a little bit of that. That was about the only thing we ever had to feel. Not wasn't overindulged, but just a little sip of that and that stuff. So that was brought in that regard. Then we spent after I came back, there was a lot of missions where we were There was some activity, not a tremendous amount, because we're on the skirting. It really got into the heavy stuff. Now, Fraser's group ran into a few things in the 3rd platoon, and he became a platoon leader, by the way, at E6. John was really squared away, and he ran into a few things. And then John Smith, Lieutenant Smith, was the 2nd platoon, or no, the 1st platoon leader. I think John was 3rd platoon, and then or was John Smith 2nd platoon leader? I can't remember now. Anyway, so we did some things. We were still platoon-size elements doing that stuff before we got into that.
About how many men would be in a platoon most of the time?
Well, that varied. You normally less than 30 most of the time. It was, between 25 and 30 most of the time. 12 to 13 men, 14 men, depending upon people rotating in and out. And that was one of the things that you tried to not allow yourself to become extremely attached to people, because you weren't sure they were going to rotate out or other things could happen to them, and so you hardened your heart a little bit. When things did happen there, I'm sure many of the times people felt bad that things happened, but we're grateful or thankful it wasn't them. I mean, that seemed hard and cruel, but it wasn't. I mean, you still have the basic instinct to survive, and you're fortunate to do that. But we had some guys that got along pretty well together. We didn't have any issues in that regard.
When new guys rotated in, within your platoon anyway, did people make an effort to orient them or get them ready, or did
there was the thing about the FNG coming in there, and there was a few tall tales in the beginning to kind of what they were trying to do. As I learned through my thing, they were trying to keep you on your toes. So the last thing they wanted you to do is make a lot of noise at night. And a few things like that, and if you were scared beyond your wits, you usually were pretty quiet. First of all, you weren't going to snore because you weren't going to sleep, and so those things were I guess you call it an initiation, but in retrospect, the people were really trying to make sure that they understood what we had to do, and we worked as a unit. You could not buck the system out there. There wasn't room, there wasn't time for that kind of stuff. We didn't, we had to be together. You had no choice. You were going to be together. And oftentimes you got to know those men a lot closer than maybe you wanted to, but yet you probably relayed to them things that you probably wouldn't even tell your own brother or sister in life. Some things, because you might not see them again, and you probably wouldn't in life. But so there was a lot of things there, and John and I had gone through the training, so we knew each other, stateside and over there. So that thing was a little bit a unique situation for us compared to most of them there, And I think we were on. Was it on Catherine? Where did I? No, someplace we were in a joint venture. Maybe it was at Firebase. If it wasn't Catherine, I don't remember which one it was. But I was talking to John one day, and I said, John, I said, Nixon's got this early out program. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, I just was reading this. I said, it says that if you're out of country, if you get out of country with less than 5 months to go in service, that you can get an automatic out of the military. I said, really? I said, so John, on a certain day here in July, if we're wounded after that day, just bad enough to get out of country, we can get an early out. And John looked at me and said, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And that's his main brogue there. And he said, why do you think of something? Well, I just was bringing up the facts. I was trying to make it a little bit lighter. Well, John and I went back together in that company thing up in that area, and got wounded on the same day together.
Now, while you're in that period, sort of kind of June into July there in 1970, the Ripcord thing is particularly intense at the beginning of July because they
Oh,
begin
yes.
to bombard the Firebase. Did you have any idea what was going on over there, or were you just kind of going out wherever they sent you on patrols?
Well, no, we could actually, in just about all of our AO area, we could, at some point in time throughout the day, you could see Ripcord.
Okay.
Because it was one of the predominantly higher. There was a couple that were higher, but from where we were, we could see Ripcord. We could see the bombardment that was happening there. We did not know how many people were out there, at least in the beginning. Now, obviously, at the battalion level, they knew. And we certainly knew when we got medevaced out because pilots were telling us. But we did see the bombardment. We watched birds get shot down. You know, we knew that there was some issues going on there, you know, and realized that, and the word got back that they were going to blow a lot of the armament in place, and that we did not know that they had built a fire base on top of 2 regiments of NVA that were in the base of the hill, which is
Well, not physically directly under them, but right
in and around that area. And I think that, you know, their intent was to try to kick him out of there. I don't think they even realized to the scope of how many people were there.
Yeah, they didn't until the last few days when they tapped into the communications line and found out that there was a whole division massed around them. And
oh yeah, and it was interesting because, you know, they had determined that we were probably, with the pilots that I spoke with, and of which I was in touch with one of them, indicated that he never saw so many enemy accumulated in areas when he was flying sorties out medevacs. He said, I can't believe how many people are down there. But it was, that time was, John and I were together. We went into the hot LZ. He took his group to one side and took down there, and they ran into an ambush, as which we did up on the other side. He lost a couple men there. And we didn't lose any men on our side. We did have one. We did get one, but the problem is they kept us busy just long enough that we couldn't dig in, and so we didn't dig in that particular time. And we slept above ground, so to speak, and then we got a greeting about 7 o'clock, 7:30 in the morning, just after we heard the thump of mortar tubes going off, and the first 2 or 3 were maybe 50 yards or plus there, but the rest, the next 150 to 200 rounds were right on top. Now, fortunately, we were in triple canopy jungle, so a lot of those were exploding or hitting limbs and going off, and could have been a lot worse.
Okay. Now, were you physically on the side of a hill or a base, or where are you?
We were kind of off. My group, we had it kind of off the side towards Ripcord, but off the side of the trail that was coming down that ridgeline to get to the LZ.
Yeah.
And I had one, and I can't think of his name right now, but when that barrage was happening, we were trying to organize and make sure that, you know, we did have some contact on the outside, so I was trying to make sure everybody was well aware of what was going on. Just don't fire at everything. We don't know, you know, you don't want all your ammo to be gone. But one of the things that I had a fellow come up during that barrage, and he says, Sarge, he said, we got to do something with my arm. And I looked at his arm, and his arm right in this area was bent in a U. And I said, how in the world did you do that? He says, you're not going to believe this, but a mortar round came down, landed on my arm, and didn't go off. I said, whoa, that's amazing. And I wished I knew the gentleman's name at that point in time, because that would have, you know, he survived in that. We did have one medic who was relatively new in country, had been there a couple months, and I thoroughly believe he died of shock. He wasn't wounded quite as bad, but he was really in shock, and we tried to talk him out of it. I tried to talk him, you know, you're going to be okay. You're wounded. We'll get you on a helicopter going back. Well, then Ranger assigned me to the detail to accumulate all the wounded up on the high side of the LZ, and then my duty was to try to get them down, help them whatever I could, get them down to the helicopters, and do that. Then there was I ran across, and I'll tell this now, that I was, you know how care pages are made in today, where we look at care pages when we know somebody's in the hospital. Mm-hmm. Well, on the side there's the advertising, and in there said Helicopter Rescues Delta Company, and Ripcord was in the name. So I clicked on it, and I started reading about this, and it was this helicopter telling his story, a pilot, Larry Rosen, telling his story about extracting Delta Company from there. And I mean, I'm sure he wasn't the only pilot, but he was there, and he was talking about a sergeant going out and bringing guys out, and that, and his wife had read a blurb, said, if you want to talk to him, here's his email address. Well, I clicked on it, and I sent him an email. I said, Larry, that was me, and Terry Handley, and I really want to thank you for all that you did. And I mean, because listen, I mean, that he was a target. You know, we had 51 millimeters trained in on that LZ. And I mean, us getting to the helicopter, we were, you know, that wasn't part of us thinking about that, but these guys were in the air, were getting fired at. And I'm sure that, you know, they were coming around us, but I wasn't aware of that happening at the time, because you weren't thinking about that. You're trying to get these guys out of there. And then one of them actually was ready to land in an RPG. Somebody had snuck up close to the perimeter, and RPG was able to knock the rear rotor off, and it had to be set down. Well, and I don't blame the helicopter pilots. They got out of that bird fast, because you didn't know if it was going to blow up or not. I mean, if it blew up, you were gone. I mean, all that oil, the fuel lines kept pumping. You know, they were electronic, and so it became a towering inferno, so to speak. And that kind of hampered us. But it started edging itself a little bit off to the edge of the LZ, because it was hopping, and it had no rotor on it, but it was hopping up and down. It couldn't go anywhere, but the blade was still turning. And Ranger told me, he said, take a pilot, go down there and shut it off. I said, Ranger wants us to go down and shut it off. He said, what? I said, we got to go down and shut it off, because we got other helicopters that have to come in here. We can't have that.
Because the big rotor is still going on the top of the helicopter.
Yeah, so we went down and we shut that off. I didn't shut it off, but I got him down there. We shut it off, and then came back, and I think they got out on the next helicopter going out. That wasn't Rosen, I don't believe. And then I had another medic who was short in country that came on, and he was in our group. I don't know how he got up by me, but he was in our group. He was really short. He transferred in from someplace else. Obviously, there was some losses, and so he came into that. And he said he was sick. I said, you know, I'm sorry you're sick, but we have lost a medic, so we need you to stay here. And he said, well, I'll just talk to company commander. And while I was on the phone with Ranger, and I were communicating back and forth quite a bit with sorties coming in and out. And I said, I have a fellow here who's ill and wants to leave, a medic. I says, what's your position? He says, well, Ranger wasn't very polite about that. He says, just tell him to stay the you-know-what right there. And I told him, I says, I talked to him. I says, all right. Gave him the phone to the medic, and Ranger told him the same thing I did. Well, in the very last, I was on going to be the last bird out. I had Roses, my RTO, who was about 6'4", 6'5". Not RTO. He was the machine gunner. Okay. He chose to take the machine gun halfway through his time there, and that's fine. And he was wounded, not extremely bad, but bad enough that we had to get him out of the field. And right when that last bird came in, the 51 caliber hit up, and it killed one of the pilots. And so they took off. Well, Rose was 6'5". There's just supposed to be two of us on there. Rose was 6'5". He dove he was able to leap onto the thing. And I was going to go back. And just as I went back, this medic came out and panicked and grabbed a hold of the skid and wrapped his legs around the skid and rode the helicopter out. Well, then I didn't go back. I kind of crouched down watching what was going to happen to him. Because, I thought if he was going to be close, maybe we'd, but about a click or so away, the wind became so much that he fell into the canopy, or into the jungle, and so that happened to him. And in Keith Nolan's book, he mentioned there was some confusion about that, but in my mind there wasn't much confusion. And I think if Ranger was alive, he would have said there was no confusion on what he was directed to do. But I understand shortened country, all that stuff happening. You're not always thinking rationally, and I'm not holding that against the guy. But he ultimately paid. I had the military came around about 3 or 4 months after I was out and wanted a detailed report. Sat down with me for an hour or so, asking questions about that particular incident and that too. But so anyway, when I get finally another bird came in to take me out. And I was the last wounded one at that particular time.
Okay, now were you wounded at that point yourself?
Yes.
Okay.
I'd been wounded. I was wounded early in the day, all that time.
Okay, and was that mortar round or other?
It was
fire?
mortar shrapnel from a mortar round.
Okay.
It was in my left thigh and in the buttocks and stuff. And
So you were getting all the other guys off while you were carrying that stuff around in your legs.
yeah, but I wasn't thinking about that. And it didn't hurt then. I mean, it hurt when I got back to Camp Evans, but it didn't hurt right then. Your adrenaline's flowing, and you're not doing it for any intensive purpose except you got friends that need help to get out. That's what your goal is, and service the men. So we got out, and like I say, my hats off to Larry Rosen and all those flyers that knew what they were flying into every time they came up on that LZ.
Now, where in the process does Captain Workman get killed?
Okay, that happened after I left the field,
Okay.
He told me before on the last bird out. He just said, "Hey, you did a great job." I says, "Nah, it's just." I said, "Don't talk like that. That wasn't But he did thank me for that, and he says, "We'll talk to you when we get back in." And then of course it happened to him. I think the next day or the day after is when he walked into the.
I guess the next day is
the bird.
one more day. Yeah.
Yeah, he was there, and then the bird somehow. I don't know if it was uneven ground. I don't know exactly how it happened, but anyway, the rotors were there with him.
Because I guess they were there. Some of you guys got out that day, and then the rest had to stay overnight and get out.
Like Lieutenant John Smith, he was there afterwards. He was with Ranger when he was killed. He was there. But I will say one thing right now. I'll go on record. That Ranger was an excellent, excellent commander. You almost felt like you were. With the decisions he made, you almost felt like you were under an umbrella. I mean, he made good decisions. A graduate of West Point, just a super guy, one of the best company commanders. And Captain Patrick Skinner, prior to him, was also an excellent guy. So I was pretty blessed to have some good company commanders there that really helped us through everything. Obviously they stay a little bit aloof of the whole. They weren't going to go and drink with you too much and that kind of stuff. But we did enough of that on our own by ourselves, not out in the field on that. But so John Frazier was wounded that same day, and so we got him out. And when I got back to Camp Evans, everybody was grabbing me and hugging me and saying, "Hey, we're glad to see him." Why? I said, "Why are you doing this?" Well, we heard you fell off a helicopter. No, it wasn't me, but Roses reported because I was the one right behind him, so he had anticipated that. So it wasn't. So he got back and that. So then John gets pushed to Guam to get his operation. I go to the hospital ship for my operation, and I would just a few hours away. They said from having real serious things with infection. I mean, by that time they'd given me enough painkillers that I really didn't mind. And then I think we had an award ceremony on board the ship. Somewhere I had a picture of it of getting the Purple Heart and a few things like that. But so then on my hospital ship, I'm shipped up to Japan, to the hospital up in Japan. And in the same ward, I look up and there's John Frazier again. So we stayed together all through all that, and then he got out about a month or two later than I did because his wounds were in both legs, so it took him a little longer to recover from. And while there in Japan, we could walk down to the NCO club, and so we decided in our hospital gowns we're going to go down there to the NCO club and have a few beers, And especially after I had an E7 come up to me and said, "Sergeant, you need to shave your mustache off." He says, "You got to set an example for some of these younger troops and stuff." And I said, "Why don't you go fight a war? I just got through and I'm not shaving my mustache off." Well, he went and got the colonel and brought him over, who happened to be a doctor. He said, "This guy won't shave his mustache off." He says, the colonel says, "Leave him alone." leave him alone. Just go. And so the guy was probably not very nice to me the rest of the time, but I didn't care. So anyway, John and I decided to go have a beer at the NCO club, and we're in our hospital gown, so we're going down there. And as you know, when you have an adult beverage, after a while you have to relieve yourself. So we went into the latrine, John and I, and he was in a wheelchair, so I was helping her. I was on a crutch, and kind of limping along, and we probably looked like made quite a pair. And most of the time in the NCO clubs, especially there, I'm sure most of them were lifers, very extremely, conservative, and also like to imbibe a little bit. So, I mean, that's those type of people are gravitated. But John and I wanted a beer, so I went down there, and then John said he had to go to the latrine. I said, I do too. So I went in there, and then John says, now how am I going to get into there? I said, here's what we do. And I said, I'll stand here, and we'll open the door, and I'll put my arms under you, and I'll hop on one leg, and I'll kind of ease the pressure on your legs and set you back on the stool. Well, I did that. He opened his gown, and so he sat on the stool. Well, then, when the door closed behind us, we both realized how funny we must look. So we started laughing. I mean, we started really giggling, because you already had enough in you, and we're laughing. And we hear the door open, and obviously, we don't not sure who it was, but we figured it was probably two lifers that had come in, and into the NCO, into the latrine had to go, and they heard two guys giggling in a stall. They shut up immediately. They went back out and didn't come back in there again while we were in there. And when we went out there, every eye in the NCO club was on these two guys that happened to be in a stall together. I mean, it was completely innocent, but it was kind of an ironic thing. And that's kind of what John and I had, good relationships like that. It's funny. John was one of the funniest guys, and I dearly miss him today. And one of the most squared away guys too, as far as the military was concerned there. But another one of these guys that would do anything for you. And we really became even closer after Vietnam. He worked for the state police of Maine, and they had a convention here in Grand Rapids. And at the time, that our youngest daughter, who you saw leave here earlier, she was maybe 7 or 8 years old. Well, John had a daughter about the same age that died of meningitis, and so he adopted Susie as his surrogate daughter, and became really attached to her because she was about the same age and acted a lot like he remembered his daughter. His older daughter, Allie, when we went to visit John after he became ill, but I mean he was still able to go around, Allie came up to Susie. So this is the young girl who has her picture on our refrigerator, and it's talked about nonstop by my father. This is my other sister, huh? And so John was, he never made a big deal about that, but obviously to his family he talked about it, and Barb, like Barb said, she didn't want to go visit John because of the experience we had with the one reunion, with all that. But once she met John, she fell in love with John and Linda, and which Maine people they don't associate with outsiders very well. I mean, they try to be more contained within themselves. But Linda and my wife just got along like they'd sisters from the time they met, and that was a really good thing with John. So, but
so you're in Japan. How long did they keep you in Japan?
I'm going to say it was there probably about a week and a half. Is all I was there. John might have been there a tad bit longer, but then he went back, and I'm not sure which hospital he went back, but it's probably out east, and then spent some time there. I went to the hospital and Great Lakes Naval Hospital, and there they informed me that when they did some testing that I had hearing loss and that I was eligible for disability. And I said, "Oh, that sounds good. Okay, great." I mean, I get, because I still have ringing in my ears, and from tinnitus and that stuff, and the hearing is I don't have my hearing aids in right now, but in a room I need the hearing aids in. But I said, "That's good. So what do I have to do?" He says, "Well, you have to sign here, and we'll have to wait till everything is through." I said, "Well, how long does that take?" He said, "About another month." I said, "No, I don't need it. I don't need that disability for waiting. I'm not waiting another, I said, "How soon?" He said, "About a week." I said, "Then I don't need the disability. I'll worry about that somewhere down the road, And so I spent time, and then I was able to get leaves. And I had a friend of mine from college and also from high school fraternity brother too that happened to be in the Woolworth training program, and he was up there, so I would go up and stay overnight there with them in that during that time.
All right.
So,
And so basically, then you had been in the service long enough in Vietnam that now you basically get your discharge.
yeah, I got the discharge in the latter part of August or first part of September. No, it was August, the last week or so of August
All right.
of 1970.
So once you get the discharge, what do you do?
Well, I come back, and a friend of mine, his dad owned a vending machine company, and I had been married when I went into the service. That didn't go too well afterwards. There was a lot of changes made, so I ended up with a divorce there. And I went back to school, and I got a 2-year degree in business, and I ended up going up to Western and taking some classes up there. Woolworth called me. They wanted me to come back. They wanted me to be in the Chicago area, and they said, within a year or two you can have your own store. Well, it sounded enticing, but I didn't want to go into that big metropolitan area. I just wasn't as comfortable doing that. So I came back, and I worked with my brother and I. We did tree service, working our way through school, and ended up at Western Michigan taking classes there. And then I met my wife, and we decided to get married. So about 10 months after we started dating, we got married, and never looked back from there. But then I decided to. When I got a job, I said, well, I have to really get serious about a career here. And so I got a job with Michelin Tire Corporation. I hadn't quite finished my degree yet. And he said, well, we don't hire people that don't have a graduate degree. And the headhunter did. I said, I tell you, you get me the interview, and I will get the job. You just get me the interview. And so they did that. And so I went in for my interview with Michelin Tire, and the second interview, and they said, well, gee, and I had a mustache. Remember the story about telling me to shave it off? Well, that was kind of maybe the thing holding you on to the times you had there. And the fellow at Michelin, one of the people who were interviewing me, says, well, if we ask you to come to work for us, what about that mustache? I said, have you got a razor? And I said, I really want to work for your company. And I said, I will do a good job. So I worked for Michelin Tire. I had a choice. I went through the training program out in New York, Lake Success, New York, and we lived in Hempstead out there for the 3 months. And I got that training out there, and then I came back, and then I had a choice between Detroit or Atlanta, and I was raised in Michigan. I said, let's go down to Atlanta. So we went to Atlanta, was there for about a year and a half or so. They didn't want you to make a lot of money. The first part of the time I got an increase in the sales in the area, and I said, so okay, I'm going to spend my commissions next year, but they cut your territories down a little bit. So I decided that wasn't probably the way to go. So I then moved back to Michigan, and I told my wife, I said, I need to get an engineering degree. I need, beyond business. They said, why? I said, well, you need to be if I'm going to be selling, I need to be technically oriented in that. And she said, well, we have a child. How are we going to eat? Good point. So I went and got a journeyman's tool and die maker's card. And that coming back from having an expense account, being on the road, and all your tires and gas paid for, that's quite an adjustment. So I started a landscape business on the side and did the apprenticeship in tool and die. And I went to school, so I got another 2-year degree in machine tool technology from Grand Rapids Community College. And then there I went up and with the part-time landscape business, that supplemented any income. In fact, I earned more in the summers doing that than I did all year long in the apprenticeship. And then I got my card, and my goal was to be 5 years and then be out of the trade and into an engineering, and then from there 5 years in engineering and go into sales for a company, and then 5 years down the road have my own sales company. And so I went to work for a company called RJ Tower, and they kind of escalated it. I went to work as a tool engineer after I had my card, and required you to estimate tooling, And I built a lot of it, and they taught me a little bit about the estimating thing, and then I put some stuff. I had a really good program there. And they had two customers. They had Ford and they had Honda. They were one of the first people to adapt Honda, or get into Honda as a metal stamper. And so I did that, and one of the vice president of sales, who had come from Ford, he asked me to go up and talk to this buyer one day because he knew that I liked sales, and what I discovered was that this guy was always the salesman, or the vice president was always going to talk in the afternoon. Well, this buyer had 3 or 4 silver bullets for lunch, so he was kind of crabby in the afternoon. And I first discovered that I had a morning meeting with him, and I got into the meeting, and everything went beautiful, and we related to each other and stuff like that, and then I had a meeting about a week later with him, and it was in the afternoon, and he was a totally different person. And then so I was asking the people, I says, you got to get him in the morning because he's not good after the afternoon. So I started doing that, and then had more success in that, and so that helped me develop the sales portion of it and put on the criteria. So then I was getting offers from Magna Corporation, a few people that wanted me to come over there, and another company down in Benton Harbor to be involved in sales. And my father-in-law saw this, and being the only daughter, he says, I got to have my daughter close to me. And he offered me a position in his sales company. Well, I wasn't going to take it, but then I talked to a real close friend of mine from high school who was out in California at the time. And he said, well, what is it going to be? I said, it's going to be in sales. He says, so how is that going to work? I said, well, I've got to go out and develop my own accounts. And he said, so in 5 years, what difference does it make? So why doesn't he help? Because I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to say, okay, son-in-law gets in. And that's, in fact, what happened. Well, my father-in-law was extremely successful. I always told him that he succeeded in sales and automotive despite his honesty. He was. And he became one of my role models. My dad was my first role model, then my coach in high school, and then my father-in-law. So I had 3 men role models that really set the stage, and all of them had different strengths, but all of them had integrity. That was one of the things that, and my father-in-law drove home that you don't buy the business, you don't do that. And I wasn't 3 months later that I had a similar situation where somebody was approaching me about favors that they wanted done, but I always remembered what my father-in-law said. And the other thing about it was he allowed me to develop my own things. He wanted us to bring in a tool shop to represent. He said, you've got expertise in there. We've got plastic and injection molding people that we're representing. We need some tooling involved too. So that's what I did. And so when I was with R.J. Tower, I was down at Honda quite a bit, got to know a few of the people, because I would go down with them, and because I understood tooling, I understand what their issues. We go out quality and talk to them, and they were a good company, R.J. Tower was. But there always were issues. So we went down, and I got to know some people at Honda, and they kept asking me, why don't you have your company that you're selling for, come up? I said, well, I don't think that company's quite ready for you yet. And they said, why not? I said, well, I understand what kind of company you want, what kind of organization you want. So eventually, I hooked up with a tooling shop, and I went down and talked to them. I says, I've got a tooling shop that'll meet your needs. And then we became the first company, and I was a contract salesman, but I was, they're only outside salesmen. We want you to be what they call a co-manage. It was a new program, and where they would have us bid on the business, and if we were competitive, they want us to have it. Their goal was to have 3 to 4 shops build the same type of tools over and over again, to be repetitive, to cut costs, but more importantly, to understand timing and know Honda's ways. And so I spent 25 years supplying Honda with tooling, and it was a good life, and that kind of stuff. So, and I drove a Honda today, but I bought it used. I didn't. Some people criticize me for that, but they had more American content than a lot of the other ones do. And they were loyal. They were loyal to me. They were loyal to many of them. I mean, I've worked with companies, and I've watched how the old Donnelly Corporation, that now Prince, Magnus bought them out. I watched how they would bring people into their plant, and teams of people, rather than move the project somewhere else, they would help them work out the quality issues and the tooling issues so that they could continue on, because they realized it costs more money to train a new supplier than it did to upgrade the current supplier. And you didn't get into Honda unless you knew what you were doing. So,
Okay.
but,
All right. So you came out of the Vietnam thing in the end in pretty good shape.
yeah, I mean, when I first got married to my wife, there were nights when I would wake up, and it's kind of interesting. Some of the dreams I had were not dreams that I remembered, but I know that I woke up startling, and you know, you hear stuff about people sleeping with a weapon beside their bed. I didn't need that at all. That wasn't the issue, but I did have that. I noticed that my temper. I was always a little bit of a hothead, you know, growing up and stuff, and that's part of the Irish in me. But it went to a little more, and then I realized that I had to start controlling that because I couldn't be in business and do that too. So some very valuable lessons that some of my role models taught me along the way was, you know, accept responsibility for something that happens and go on from there. And that did help me in business. You know, there's a couple times when I made a decision and some people didn't think it was good, and I said, well, you know what, I made a mistake. Okay, it really probably wasn't a mistake, but they didn't agree with it, so it was a mistake. But as soon as I said, you know, I'm wrong, we'll work on that again, it deflated any argument they had. And so I realized that worked, so that worked great in sales as well. But I never tried to have my idea be the idea. So if we were ever in a meeting and I was in a meeting with some of my suppliers or my customers, you know, if there was an idea, we'd talk about it, and I wouldn't bring up who initiated the idea. It didn't matter. But when we got into further conversation with other people, then I would promote that guy as the guy that had the idea, because I knew that if it came from that guy would work really hard for that idea if it was a good one. And that, so I learned, you know, you don't need to get credit for stuff. And certainly I didn't do anything over there for any credit that was initially trying to do. There was no, and I don't regret any lack or embarrassed about any credit that was given. It's, to me, that's not the important thing in life anyway. I've learned that you need to serve people.
Do you think that the Vietnam experience really kind of, in some ways, that it helped you later on? That you took something out of that was helpful to you, or did you just kind of stay the same guy the whole time?
No. I think that I think it helped me develop loyalty. You know, you learn to say, "Hey, guy, I love you." I've got friends right now that I play in a little ad hoc band, and you know, taking up the drums for whatever reason. I thought I'm not a drummer. Don't ever accuse me of being a drummer, but I try to hit them once in a while. And there's a group of us, about 4 or 5 guys, and some of those guys I love like a brother. You know, and I don't mind telling them that I love them. You know, and I don't, you know, I don't have an ego about that respect. You know. I love to talk to people and enjoy that. That's my nature in the sales side of it. But I think that Vietnam, a couple things. It strengthened my faith in God, in Christ. I truly believe that my mother-in-law passing was part of God's design to do that. And as the religious, I knew 2 saints in my life. My grandmother was one, by far. And that was a testimony to people who were at the funeral and stuff. And the memorial afterwards, and my father-in-law. Those 2 were saints, truly were saints. They were really good people, through and through. My wife is, I consider, a saint. She really is a good person. I certainly don't deserve her, you know. But I think that Vietnam brought that out. Vietnam kind of made you compartmentalize hard issues, and made you realize that if you didn't have control over something, you better not worry about it. Worry about what you can control, and the other stuff will take care of itself. And if there comes a point in time when that issue comes up and you can't control it, then deal with it then. And that's kind of the philosophy that Vietnam did with me. And I really don't have. I have compassion for people who are still blaming their lot in life on some of their experiences in the military. I have compassion, but I don't accept their premise. You have to get beyond that. Your mind has to. I mean, if you let it, you could let it drive you crazy. Some of the things over there with some of the people that I met, and some of the things that happened over there, you know, were totally unfair as far as the whole big scheme of things in life. You know, why wasn't I? Wasn't this? But you can't dwell on that. And as soon as you do, then you're not affecting the other people. And we've got responsibilities here to the younger generation, to the people that are coming back from the wars today, to work with them, nurture them. There's a lot of talk about the stress disorders, post-traumatic stress disorders. And I'm not saying it's not legitimate, but some people need to guide them that have had experience and get around that. It isn't just about giving them drugs and that. These people don't want that. They don't want it. And the other thing is, most of them are proud that they served. And what I do have to say about that generation, we got drafted, or I enlisted because of the draft. And we didn't have a lot of choice. These kids have choices, and they chose to do that. So you have to admire them for that. And it's so, but they still need some guidance and help. So any time that somebody can, I think, present like you're doing today, people talking about a normal life after a war, I think it's important for those people to understand that there can be life there, regardless of what handicaps you have, you know, and that kind of stuff. You know, Agent Orange affected me as far as diabetes is concerned, but I'm not bitter about that. It happened. So you deal with it, you know, and you work on it. So my wife was probably a little frustrated at time in the beginning with my temper and that, but I realized that I can't do that. And I still have, once in a while I see the stress coming up, but I tried to deal with it and started to back off, you know. I mean, I'm not going out and kicking a dog, anything, you know. One child said I spanked her too much, but she's probably my biggest defender. Other ones I haven't spanked at all, you know. And that I was always the disciplinarian, and my wife is not so much there, but she's just a golden person. That's why. Yeah. But I would say, by and large, the experience in Vietnam, if you got by the negative things, the positive things, the people that you met, how you grew up, I appreciate this country more and more. And I'm going to stay away from the politics, but I'd like to see our people get what they deserve in life, and that's a free country. Then we can use this country so much more by affecting other countries if we allowed them to remain free. The American people have a spirit about them that anytime there's something happening in the world, we're right there. And if we would just throw the politics aside and let us just help these other countries become, you know, contributors in the world too, we would all be a better for that. So,
well, that makes a pretty good closing point.
Yeah.
We're about out of tape, so thank you very much for talking to me today.
And I hope I didn't ramble too much on it. So.
Tape is cheap.
Okay.
All right.
But yeah.